Hello, and welcome to this lecture covering Chapter 24 from the Cosmic Perspective, ninth edition. Here we're going to talk about the topic of life in the universe. We're going to take a number of perspectives to tackle this topic. This would be life outside of the planet Earth. Are we alone in the cosmos? Well, as far as we know, the answer is yes. We have never confirmed any life, even a microbe, a tiny single cell organism, or any such small, simple life form off of the planet Earth. There's no evidence that there's life anywhere else in our solar system or in any other solar system. However, that doesn't mean there isn't. And if we think about the sheer scale of the universe, well, it becomes a quite interesting question. So let's talk then to give us some perspective about our single sample where we do know there is life, and what do we know even defines life? Like what can we expect, or should we expect, if we're going to find life elsewhere? Okay, so to give that perspective, we're going to have a geological, or of course, astronomical perspective on life, looking back billions of years, and that will answer the question: when did life arise on Earth? We'll also answer the question, how did life arise on Earth? At least some very reasonable theories. And what are the necessities of life? As far as we understand it, what are the not just the building blocks, but just the basic criteria? So where should we even expect to find life? All right, so we're going to look at pictures like this that show the entire geological history of life, because life has been around for most of our planet's history. It is as embedded in the history of this planet as rocks are. All right, well, at least a billion years short, but most of the history of the planet. So when did the earliest life come from? Well, based on isotope evidence, looking at particular isotopes that behave in a certain way when they come into contact with an organism and they're involved in a metabolic process that is essentially a specialized gradient of energy that's associated with an organism, because organisms take energy in that of course allows them to grow and digest and do whatever it is that keeps them alive. And if there's minerals and particular radioactive isotopes that are involved with that process, then when they're part of this organism, the sample and like the proportion of those radioactive isotopes are different than they would be in other natural processes. So we can tell that what's happening with life is a particular flow of energy, because that's what life does, right? It creates a more orderly organism, a more orderly system out of disorder, and it does it by absorbing energy. It is a manifestation of natural processes as far as we know, but it does have these telltale signatures, and we can see those as far back as 3.85 billion years. Okay, and that's just really shortly after the end, a particular point in the history of our solar system, heavy bombardment. This is a dominant topic in astronomy. If you're not familiar with it, there are plenty of videos I've recorded where I talk about the concept of heavy bombardment. It's exactly what it sounds like, very hostile for life. But life perhaps actually persisted throughout many periods of time where the planet was essentially what we would think of as completely unlivable, with lava flows and vast fires that covered most of the planet, and in just a huge amount of heat, the entire rudimentary atmosphere catching on fire and such. But life persisted as far as this isotope record suggests. And shortly after that, at about 3.5 billion years, there's actually the first fossil record. So we're only going back 350 million additional years to go from 3.5 to 3.85 to even make these claims about this incredible basis of life. And then we see direct evidence of it. Life found a way, and life on this planet has been incredibly tenacious. There is life that has persisted and even thrived in habitats that are incredibly hostile, especially from the perspective of humans living on the Earth, and obviously in the opposite of a hostile environment. So it really makes us think about, if life is so incredibly successful and tenacious here on our planet, shouldn't it be doing the same elsewhere given the same opportunities? And in other words, on other worlds and other planets. So how do we even discuss the history of life? How do we come up with a number like this? Well, an important idea that lends validity to dating life is that we have a layering process which gives us relative age. So we look at relative age as the idea that there are deeper and deeper layers that exist within the Earth. So everything has been layered on top of each other. But we then need some absolute date. So then we can look at one layer and say, we absolutely know this layer is this old, therefore a layer underneath maybe we don't know its exact date, but we can at least know that it must be older or younger than what we know as an exact date. Well, how would we find any exact date within a system of a bunch of layers? Well, we need something that is the equivalent of a standard candle for astronomy, some independently verifiable piece of evidence, an independent variable, something that we can actually measure in a separate way from this layering effect. And that is radioactive isotopes. This idea that we look and I'm not talking about the ones that are being absorbed by life here, but ones that just sat in rock for a certain amount of time, because we can then say, well, this was formed from a dead organism. When the organism died, it stopped, basically resetting the clock. From that point on, that sample has just been decaying. So it had some initial amount, which would have been representative of like the organism and the average at that point in Earth's history. And since then, that amount of radioactive atoms in some sample, it might be a tiny little piece of a fossil, has been decaying. But even in a tiny fraction of a gram piece of a fossil, there are still going to be trillions of individual atoms, because atoms are so tiny, and those individual atoms are decaying. That is the process of radioactive decay, independent of the outside environment, which is so important. Radioactive decay can't get slowed down or sped up if that fossil was in a particularly warm, cold, high pressure, or whatever. And so we look at it and we know for sure that how old that fossil is, thus dating that entire layer. And so that is the basis of everything we talk about in terms of the dates on our planet. And of course, those dates then have validity outside of the planet. How does that match up with the proposed age of the sun? How does it match up with the proposed age of other planets? And if we see consistency, then that adds further validity to the theory, right? And we do, right? So we see, this idea of geological consistency compared to astronomical consistency within our own solar system. And here's, of course, is a beautiful example of layering of rocks shown in the Grand Canyon, with over 500 million years of Earth's history and many, many layers, hundreds of layers or dozens of layers, okay? Here is someone in a white outfit, a very dramatic white outfit, I've noticed, but perhaps they're the artist of exposing fossils here, like delicately breaking them out. I suppose it was a very particular skill. And although they do look an awful lot like Elvis, I might say, but regardless, this is just, an iconic image of thinking about what fossils tell us, okay? In this case, looking at dinosaur fossils from the Dinosaur National Monument in the Western United States. And dinosaurs are a relatively recent fossil, right, in the overall history, only at about, some 200 million years up to about 60 million years. And that is incredibly recent. I mean, that's just a quarter of a billion years, because the first fossil record coming, later than those, more indirect isotope evidence, is at 3.5 billion, which is 3,500 million. And that is this particular type of bacteria-like organism that kind of grew like coral does today, where it created a rigid skeleton that then you left a permanent record that we could see as a fossil. Because lots of organisms, even ones that are alive today, do not leave fossils. Think something like a jellyfish or a squid, organisms that really don't have much rigid flesh. They don't leave much behind, where we can definitively say that what we're looking at is a fossil of life. This isn't just some naturally occurring crystal or something, right? We know for a fact that this is an organism, and if we look at that fossil at a microscopic level, we can even see things like remnants of cells and remnants of like a structure, like a respiratory structure or a cardiovascular or something like that. So this idea that we're really seeing an organism, but sometimes that the details of the organism are lost just because a fossil is a turning an organism into a rock. Obviously, a lot of the actual soft tissue of that organism gets lost. But in this case, with the stromatolites, we really see something that is clearly a life form, and what's more, actually has analogs in living relatives today. There are, in Western Australia, there's a relatively close relative that's been around for 3.5 billion years, only evolving a little bit, that still has its niche in a particular environment in coastal seas, that grows in the same way that we think stromatolites did way back, the first fossils ever created 3.5 billion years ago. So here is that geological timescale, looking at life in a little bit more detail, looking right at that point where we're looking at the oldest stromatolites at 3.5 billion years, and some carbon isotope evidence going almost all the way back to 4 billion years. As far as the names here of these periods of Earth's history, the Hadean refers to basically heavy bombardment. Hadean is a term associated with like hell or the abyss. The idea is that this was a point where the Earth was completely inhospitable. It was a lava land of chaos. The Archean is this idea that this is the most archaic. This is the earliest form of life. When we look at these fossils, it's curious about how they fit into the overall tree of life and evolution. And since that time, though, there's been some clear epochs, some clear changes that have happened, including particular types of bacteria that evolved let's see, at just short of the 3.5 billion year mark, which is the white line here. We see the earliest evidence of oxygen in the atmosphere because particular types of cyanobacteria were actually producing oxygen. This process of having a byproduct, a particular respiratory process that took in carbon dioxide, and then of course it was tied in with the photosynthesis, because the cells that specialize in photosynthesis, the so important evolutionary mutation of being able to collect energy from the sun, and turn it into fuel, like sugar-based fuel for plants. That process ended up involving the intake of CO2 and the output of pure oxygen. So we ended up with an atmosphere unlike any other one in the solar system that actually had lots of free oxygen. Mostly O2, some O3, which is known as ozone, which plays its own important role today in terms of UV absorption, which makes the world that much more habitable on the surface, on the land. But back then, organisms did not live on the land. So as we look at this buildup of the oxygen phase happening in the Proterozoic, right? Kind of difficult to pronounce, but the Proterozoic epoch of the geological history of the planet, life forms are still entirely living in the oceans. Okay, but we do have some eukaryotic, which is in biology, it's an important sort of a cellular type that is considered more advanced from the earliest cellular types. And then we go on to get a famous point in the evolution in terms of the Earth's oceans, which is the Cambrian explosion. This is where an incredibly diverse amount of life was living in the oceans. There still was little to no organisms living on the land, at least no complex organisms, but life in the oceans had proliferated. Huge fish, incredibly complex diversity. It just nothing like we even see today, and the oceans are still a hotbed of incredible diversity and interesting animals, as well as plants and other trees of life. But at some point, of course, life did start to get onto the land, which we see here at the 500 million year mark. Notice that our scale has changed. We've in fact we've zoomed in on this last epoch here, which is just 500 million years, which is the Phanerozoic. So instead of showing a scale in terms of billions of years, we're showing a scale in terms of a tenth of 1 billion years, which is 100 million years. So we've zoomed in on the end of the Cambrian, and we get into another series of eras here: the Ordovician, the Silurian, the Devonian. These are famous eras in terms of different organisms that evolved. We have the first kind of lizard organisms in the Silurian. But we also, as you see in the Ordovician, have plants and fungi start to colonize the land. Once land animals, and well, in this case, land plants and fungi took off, there was a huge opportunity there. The land, it obviously didn't offer the same 3D richness as oceans, but in terms of just the nutrient flow, the water cycle in rivers, there was actually a huge concentrations of life that could flourish, and then through migration, life could just thrive in a way that then fed back to the oceans, and it just led to just more diversity and just a more rich just habitat of life, this bastion of life that is planet Earth. and we continue on until animals evolving on land, as you can see in the Silurian. Mammals coming much later, as around the same time as dinosaurs. Of course, dinosaurs having their famous era from over 200 million years right up to 660 million years ago. This is one of the few mass extinctions that is actually shown on this figure. There are other famous mass extinctions, but this one is the KT event, which is a very astronomical event because it's widely accepted that it was a comet or asteroid impact that led to the climate change that then led to the extinction of the dinosaurs. And a huge change in terms of what animals were going to fill particular niches, in terms of what was a successful life form. And that was then the era of the mammals, which is just this last 60 million years, which is a tiny fraction of the overall history of the planet, but the one we know the most about because that's the more recent fossil records, from the dinosaurs up till now. Are the ancestors of humans would have only started about 5 million years ago. So again, a tiny fraction of 60. So we can see that there's a huge amount of detail even in the recent fossil record. It's hard to even wrap your head around how many billions of years there is in the entirety of the fossil record. But of course, the quality of it decreases with time. But I mean, trying to make sense of it all. So life is famous for all being based on DNA, from the incredible diversity of the most rudimentary life in terms of single cell organisms, different types of bacteria. What they all share in common is that they all involve DNA. There's absolutely no exception there. There's no known life that doesn't have this process of basically passing information that then creates self-replication of that information. The idea that life can replicate itself. That's because of DNA, so that's a shared factor between all life on this planet, which is all known life. So life evolves through time, like lots and lots of complexity, lots of specializations. All life on Earth shares that common ancestor. Why do we know? Because it's all that same exact DNA. So if there was some organisms that just had some totally different way of storing and passing on information, that maybe would suggest two totally separate ancestors. But then again, to say absolutely that there's only one common ancestor and that maybe that evidence of two different common ancestors has been lost over time is up for debate. Okay, but it's usually accepted that there's just one common ancestor and not more than a few at most. And we may never know exactly how the first organisms arose, but there is some strong evidence that life can actually just be spontaneously created in certain conditions. So basically, we see this throughout chemistry. There are processes that happen in the ocean that don't involve life today, that involve kind of energy flows where we have kind of a reverse gradient where energy can start to build up in one place rather than just kind of always dispersing and spreading out. And so when that happens, and that's because of combinations of pressure and temperature, then if there's a concentration of energy, then there can be a concentration of order within that region, and then maybe that some particular molecules will come together that then happen to then be able to replicate themselves. If they then start self-replicating themselves, maybe that doesn't mean anything. Maybe they just kind of make some chain of similar chemicals, but maybe it leads to something some certain percentage of the time. And maybe that's just the odds of creating life from the so-called primordial soup. So the fossil record shows that evolution has occurred throughout time, okay? And so we see lots and lots of examples of it. What is evolution? Evolution is the idea of selection of certain random mutation. So Darwin's theory tells us how evolution occurs, right? We have natural selection, the most successful mutations happening all the time because of just the complexity of passing on that information through DNA. There's mistakes that are made through that process, right? Inherently, it's a process where things can't quite line up, right? They're never quite perfect, and sometimes the imperfections matter. So then what happens is then those certain random mutations then might be totally devastating and just cause the organism to die, or maybe just be less successful, but other times they're more successful. That's when we say that they are naturally selected for. So the theory is supported by the discovery of DNA because that totally explains from a chemistry or physics point of view where random mutations come from, because you could actually come up with very good models and observe them in terms of how DNA will line up, and sometimes it just won't line up quite right, and a lot of times that doesn't matter. There are many mismatched pairs of DNA in any individual living organism, especially more complex ones. Most of those mismatches don't matter. Only a certain amount need to be successful. But then, like I said, certain times they do create a little change. Sometimes that change isn't noticeable, sometimes it's really significant. So when we look at that tree of life, those mutations that lead to certain manifestations of more successful or less successful behavior, we can see how animals and plants and fungi and within those groups, they all split off from each other and become specialized in all these different places where they can thrive or at least survive. So when we map the genetic relationship, we can really kind of lend support to what we would observe. In other words, scientists have been looking at life and kind of thinking about the evolutionary tree for hundreds of years, ever since Darwin, well before we could actually map it with DNA. And the DNA mapping made us change the tree of life in many ways, but not completely, because it confirms some of our observations. When we look and we say, oh, well, these trees or these bugs, they look like they should be related because they look similar, that's often the case. But sometimes it's actually an example of co-evolution, two very different paths leading to what look like similar organisms, but actually it came from different directions. But regardless, DNA has been an incredible window into evolution, and we're continuing to understand it today because we need to understand life. Why? Well, of course, because we're part of life and we want to understand it here. But if in an astronomy class and as an astronomy question, because what if there's life elsewhere? Well, then we need to know what to look for. Right. And an interesting thing about the first living organisms is we see these subsurface vents all throughout the oceans today. They're particularly common on the mid-ocean rifts where the ocean plates are spreading apart, such as the mid-Atlantic ridge and similar ridges in the Pacific Ocean, Indian Ocean, where you actually have spreading apart of those ocean plates. And so on those long chains of volcanic activity, there's lots and lots of these vents that harbor life in boiling water, temperatures that are actually above boiling at what would be boiling at sea level, because the high pressure at the bottom of the ocean makes it so that they boil at even higher temperatures. So we have incredibly superheated water as far as sea level pressures are concerned. So we have this incredibly hot water, but what we have then is energy and in nutrients because of what's coming up through this whole process of plate tectonics, which is this always kind of churning and burning and recycling of nutrients. So that's a great place for life. And life thrives on these black smokers, these subsurface vents. And it's life that doesn't need sunlight at all. Totally separate energy process that doesn't rely on energy from the sun in the least. This could happen if there was no sun. If the Earth was an orphan planet, an idea I'll come back to in a few minutes, then you could have the continued release of heat from the core of the planet, because that's actually what's driving this energy, the continued radioactivity as well as the continued cooling of the planet. And that heat is the actual source of energy. You don't need sunlight. This is rare in terms of organisms that live today. Most organisms are completely involved in a food chain that involves sunlight. You all start with some plant that has photosynthesis. That's our basis of the food chain, but not here. We have a food chain that doesn't require sunlight at all. This is going to be important when we talk about not just idea of an orphan planet, which you may not know what it is. It's basically a planet that's flowing out of the solar system, but also when we talk about the context of subsurface oceans on worlds within our own solar system. We're just speculating broadly of where life might be anywhere in the galaxy, or other galaxies for that matter. But it just goes to show that life finds a way. It just needs energy and nutrients. But I am getting ahead of myself, because we will list the actual, the necessities of life. Now, I mentioned that experiments have confirmed that this kind of process of chemicals self-organizing and replicating is entirely possible in the right kind of energy conditions. A famous experiment is called the Miller-Urey experiment. It's many decades old, but it's stemmed many repeat experiments, and it's just a whole branch of science where we can show that these things are completely possible. that we can have these, these types of again, molecular processes start to form. That said, we haven't been able to like create life from scratch. There's no lab that's out there that is creating new life from just chemical scratch. So we don't understand it to that level, but that doesn't make sense. We don't understand, the human genome to that level either, right? We map the human genome, but we can't like create a human from scratch, obviously, right? So there are still some pieces. There's incredible complexity in the system that is even the most rudimentary life. That said, recent studies have showed microscopic enclosed membranes, which essentially are pre-cells. These aren't actual like life forms, but they're actually been created in a lab. And then we look at viruses, and there's a lot more research about how viruses fit into life, because they are self-replicating, right? But often they're not considered life. And so but then some viruses behave almost more like bacteria. And so it begs the question: is there a continuum there? Are viruses not completely separate from bacteria? Did one kind of become the other, and then some viruses just kept doing what they've been doing ever since? So it's very fascinating, and we should expect in decades to come we'll understand more about the fundamentals of what is life, what is this molecular process that happens. So as far as the chemicals, this series of figures kind of explains what I've been talking about, how you can get these energy concentrations to create a particular complex molecule. All right, a molecule that can create DNA to copy copy itself and have that map saved in that DNA. That DNA is a particular combination of these different types of molecules that is so good at essentially saving information. Right? It has like an alphabet, and in that way of having that repeating alphabet, it can save information in a true way. It's not just a random mix. All right. But we can't get into the whole theory of DNA here because we have to bring this back to astronomy at some point. So, could life have migrated to Earth? I've hinted at the idea that there may not be one origin to life. Maybe life, spontaneously happened between this idea of self-replicating molecules because of particular, primordial soups, high energy concentrations on, the surface of this, primordial world, or maybe life came in from above and was just in some sort of, kind of dormant state in some comet or asteroid and crashed into a warm primordial soup and then was able to essentially wake up and start replicating because, again, it had just been dormant. This idea of life being able to be dormant in harsh conditions for hundreds or thousands of years has been shown in the Arctic. We've seen it in fossils. We've been able to wake up like frozen bacteria that have been frozen or in stasis for thousands or even tens of thousands of years. So perhaps that's what happened. Maybe life essentially follows a almost astronomical Noah's Ark system passing from one planet to another. But then that begs the question, where did it all come from in the first place? So maybe it is kind of, there's conditions, but also life is good at remaining in stasis and then being able to self-propagate given the right amount of energy. And as far as that goes, when we look at certain microbes, such as the famous water bear, which is shown in this colorized X-ray image of one, which is an incredibly successful and diverse type of organism that really looks like this, and they're called water bears, which is a cute name for them because they're not exactly cuddly, with their weird alien-like mouth, but they are basically they're just too small to see with a visible eye. They'd just be a little bit smaller than the smallest speck that you can make out, which is about 50 microns, so just under that size. So that's why you always see them imaged with X-ray imagery, because you can't make them out with a visible light microscope. But regardless, there's many different versions of them throughout. They're called tardigrades, besides water bears, their common name, and they live throughout Earth. They're one of the successful microbial species, but they almost seem to be adapted to space, which begs the question: did they ever live in space? Right? Is that part of their evolutionary history? And is that a thing that life does? Right? So, quite possibly. So, in summary, brief history of life: 4.4 billion years ago, early oceans formed, but probably not life right away. Somewhere between 3.85 and 3.5, we have the earliest forms of life. And then at 3.5, cyanobacteria, as I mentioned briefly a few slides ago, started releasing oxygen. That process of oxygen releasing actually took a very long time. The idea of having an oxygenated atmosphere didn't happen until 2 billion years ago. So if a human went back through a time machine to any point later than or further back than 2 billion years from today, they would suffocate. And even then, the atmosphere probably didn't have as much oxygen, although at some point it actually got more oxygenated than it currently is. Although a lot of people think our atmosphere is primarily oxygen, it's not. It's about 24% oxygen, but plenty for us to breathe. Regardless, there's been significant amounts of oxygen ever since, and that's been very important for all these organisms that specialize to breathe oxygen, the byproduct of photosynthesis, right? This very successful way of taking in energy from the sun. Because although some organisms are perfectly fine living without the sun, the majority of them are going to take advantage of that huge amount of energy that's incoming, because it's significant, right? Especially since we've developed an atmosphere that holds in heat, and the planet has just overall kind of had this chain reaction to continue to support life. Although that isn't necessarily the case. When we look at other terrestrial planets like Venus and Mars within our own solar system, we see how this process that can harbor life and has harbored life on Earth has, first of all, nearly failed on Earth a few times. Times the entire planet has frozen over, times the amount of oxygen has gotten out of control and fires ran rampant. And so it is always a delicate balance. And when we look at Venus, we see an atmosphere that became completely inhospitable. When we look at Mars, we see a planet that essentially froze out because it was just a little too small and a little too far from the sun. So we can see how things are just always on the tipping point, and having a planet that supports life is not a guaranteed thing at all. Right, which then makes us think that maybe it's kind of a lucky thing that we're here today doing as well as we are on this, this life harboring, ship sailing through space as we are on our, our Earth. So let's look at a thought question here. You have a time machine. You're going to go back. Oh, I think I already gave this one away, but you're going to go back, deep into Earth's history, and you're going to, you're going to hop out. What should you worry about? What's the most likely thing to happen to you that, kind of macabre, but it's going to kill you? Well, it's, of course, you're going to suffocate, because there's a huge chunk, right? In fact, if there's only been minimal oxygen since, 2 billion years ago, that means out of the 4.5, the grand total from the very beginnings of Earth, like 4.5 billion years before today, excuse me. Well, that whole amount of time, only 2 of it, or less than half, has that oxygen. So your odds are not in favor of being able to breathe. So origin of oxygen, it was that cyanobacteria. They started between this process of photosynthesis, that basically the chain reaction that allows for energy to be collected with this very specialized organelle, which is itself this specialized structure within a cell. So this organelle, that can take in sunlight, it needs to pull in carbon dioxide and output oxygen. That's the only way it can actually turn that sunlight into stored fuel. So very, very interesting process there, because here we are at this very successful and incredibly complex animal that has had, it's such a large brain that we can think about our own existence and think about the stars around us, that we can speculate the role that we play in the universe, which is a pretty like high ideal for life. Well, that the only reason we ever evolved in the first place is because we evolved from a long history of these creatures that fed off the byproduct of photosynthesis. So I've said many times that there are just these few necessities for life. One of them is a nutrient source. That's on Earth. We have basically this idea that nutrients are constantly being moved around, whether that's through that kind of the weather cycle of water. We have the carbon cycle, which is mostly associated with plate tectonics. So that we have these incredibly important processes that keep nutrients moving. And so when we look at other planets or other worlds, that is something we look for. Are there nutrients? Are they not just getting concentrated in one place, but continuing recycled? And so that's what life will need ultimately, because it needs to build off of not just a couple of molecules, but quite a few, right? There needs to be a certain amount of heavy minerals, as far as we know, the irons and so on. But there has to be a lot of carbon. There has to be a lot of silicon. These are the real building blocks of life. Okay, there has to be energy. There has to be either sunlight or heat, right? There has to be some source. It can't be like, near absolute zero, totally cold. There's no energy, right? And whole life is, in the context of the second law of thermodynamics, I've said a couple times, life is more orderly. That's actually called a decrease in entropy, and that takes energy, all right? So there's no arguing against that. And as far as we know, it needs liquid water, all right? Now, there's some very interesting what's called theoretical biology that postulates that maybe life could exist in other liquids, right? But a liquid seems necessary, especially for starting life in the first place, or for more rudimentary life, or even from the bottom of the food chain, like bacteria. So, what could those other liquids be? Well, in colder environments, they could be liquid ethane or methane, which we'll come back to in a minute. So, in summary, in this first section, what have we learned? We learned that life arose about 3.85 billion years ago, but the hard evidence is at 3.5, which is just stromatolites. And we also learned that there is a common organism because we all share that DNA. So that seems to be a very specialized way of saving information, and we see it with every known amount of life on Earth, right, from the most simple to the most complex. And we talked about those necessary, you know, necessities, really. I want to say building blocks, but they're not, just the necessities of life: nutrients, energy, and liquid water, or at least some liquid. So, life in the solar system, right? So, where are we going to see it? Are we going to find it on Mars? We're going to find it in the outer solar system, right? And actually, looking at the moons of the Jovian planets is more, interesting, at least immediately, than Mars, okay? Because there's amazing history of Mars. Mars obviously had liquid water, and that is just jaw dropping. But there is probably liquid water today on some of these moons of, particularly Jupiter and Saturn. Okay, so could there have been life on Mars? Yes, yes. I mean, there was oceans. There was a huge amount of water for a short amount of time, maybe just a few 100 million years. Mars had a relatively thick atmosphere. It was holding in a significant amount of heat, despite its, kind of being right on the edge of what's known as the habitable zone, an idea we'll come back to in a minute. And it's what you think, it's basically being in the right distance from the sun to support life. And but despite that, there's this early phase where Mars was really holding on to a thick atmosphere, thick enough to hold the heat and have liquid water. It most likely, like storm systems, certainly huge bodies of water, and that's all gone because Mars has cooled off significantly. Maybe it's because of Mars's much smaller size. Mars is only half the size of Earth, so it just cooled off quickly. Maybe it lost a magnetic field that was keeping its atmosphere together, but for whatever reason, its atmosphere has escaped into space because it's been pushed away by the solar wind, and then as the planet froze, whatever was left over essentially froze down into rock. Because you can't maintain an atmosphere without enough heat. Which is kind of a catch-22, right? You need an atmosphere to have heat, but then without the atmosphere you can't have heat. So Mars definitely had liquid water in the distant past. So some 3 billion years ago, maybe more recently. Some people say up to as recently as 2 billion years, but we're sure that the more dramatic ocean covering phase of Mars was over 3.5 billion years ago, or at least 3.4 billion years ago. So really, really early on in the history of the universe. But today there's probably still some parts of the planet where water is mixing with the soil. This is the idea of briny water. There's been some images of the surface where it seems like things are moving because they're kind of sloughing off. Interesting, Mars also still does have a weak atmosphere today, actually enough to support sandstorms. So there's actually wind on Mars, but it's not an atmosphere that holds in much heat, unfortunately. So it offers the wind, but not the heat. So it's kind of not the best atmosphere for supporting life. But there is frozen water at the poles. So there definitely is water, but frozen water isn't really what you want for life. But it's interesting for humans because if we were to say colonize Mars, frozen water is incredibly important because we can melt it. Okay. There's been many missions to Mars. Most recently, Perseverance. The Curiosity rover has been incredibly successful since 2012. It's still going today, but in a reduced capacity. The more recent rover is Perseverance, which is in the height of its explorations. It's the one that brought a helicopter to Mars, which has just expanded our ability to survey the surface. We've seen no hard evidence. We haven't been able to find fossils, but we're limited by a rover. You think about what it takes for a human to dig around through rocks and find a fossil, and the amount of agility and processing of rocks and just that whole process. Well, I mean, we have a rover here that's remote controlled, hundreds of millions of miles away, and that with a delay of minutes in terms of the controls. So in fact, the more modern rovers are largely automated. They're actually kind of self-learning systems. And so, we're limited here, right? Unless we send humans to Mars, which we've never done, we probably are not going to get any breakthrough science, but hopefully we can, because in fact, the current mission, the Perseverance mission, hopes to collect samples and send them back to Earth, which has never been done. There's never been a return mission from Mars. This would be the first return sample mission ever from Mars. The only things we have ever collected from Mars have actually been rocks that were like broken off of Mars from a particularly strong asteroid impact, thrown up into orbit around Mars, but an unstable orbit that eventually got pulled into Earth's orbit and then fell into Earth's atmosphere as a meteorite, and then got picked up and recognized as a Mars rock, which is amazing. Scientists could even tell, but actually there was some really strong evidence, and there's been a few. So there kind of is this passing back and forth of rocks between Mars, Earth, and Venus has been going on ever since the planets were formed. So there are a few of these rocks, but that's it in terms of kind of direct physical pieces from Mars. Well, what about the outer solar system? I mentioned it a couple of times. We'll talk about this, which planet this image comes from. So, excuse me, which moon? Because we've been talking all about Jovian moons. Because if we're looking for life in the outer solar system, we're not going to look at the gas giants themselves. There's very little reasonable speculation to say that life could evolve, say, in the upper atmospheres of the gas giants. The conditions are just incredibly too harsh. The gravities are too high. Being on the edge of space and so on in terms of the radiation, but the moons often offer these particular, almost like micro habitats, but of course we don't know if there's any life there. They just have these interesting balances of having energy come in through tidal friction, sometimes being protected by a magnetic field from the Jovian planet. And so there's reason to think that these actually might be good little spots where life has evolved and maybe persisted ever since we have here on Earth, right? So where are we looking? Well, we're looking at habitable moons, Ganymede, Callisto, which are the so-called Galilean moons, the largest moons around Jupiter, right? We look at Europa. Europa is another wonderful example. So we have 3 potential homes for life just around Jupiter alone in terms of subsurface oceans. Titan, all right, which is a moon around Saturn, is interesting because it doesn't have any speculation about liquid subsurface oceans, but it definitely has a full liquid cycle. It has clouds. It's the only moon with an atmosphere. Full stop. Only moon with atmosphere. And I mean, that's incredibly unique. How does it even have an atmosphere? Just particular conditions of how it formed, its size. The atmosphere is not an atmosphere of hydrogen or oxygen or CO2 at all. It's an atmosphere of methane and ethane because it's a much colder moon, okay? And so these are gases that would never form in the liquid state, never be able to condense in the warmer conditions, in the so-called habitable zone of the terrestrial planets like Earth, but they're working fine out on Saturn in terms of kind of creating this liquid cycle. It rains methane and ethane. There is oceans and lakes, and apparently, kind of like, rivers that flow between them. It's at a much slower scale. So you know how we might have, a big rainstorm that happens on a yearly scale, think like monsoons in parts of the Earth that have that. There, as far as we can tell, and there's not a good orbital, spacecraft around Titan to really have this data for sure. But we're pretty sure that these storms are incredibly infrequent. Actually, only every maybe 10 Earth years or so, because they need to build up enough energy, and there's like a huge torrential rain of methane and ethane. And could this environment support life? Maybe. There's the liquid. There might be enough energy because there's some tidal friction, which we see throughout the Jovian moons. And maybe there's life that lives that is based not off liquid water, life that isn't based off H2O, that never evolved to live and propagate within H2O, but instead within methane and ethane. Maybe, So scientists are incredibly interested about it. There's actually a lot of essentially green-lighted space probes, including a lander that the second one, the first lander that went to Titan some decades ago, or about a decade ago, wasn't terribly successful, although it took a couple images. But in other words, people will be going back there, or at least our robots will be going back there, and we'll hopefully learn more about this moon in the near future. Another incredibly fascinating moon that's captured the attention of scientists in just the last 5 years is a very small moon of Saturn, but that has some strong evidence of having a subsurface ocean like Europa around Jupiter. And that strong evidence was picked up by a recent mission, the Cassini mission that went to Saturn, which is a space probe that did a lot of study of Saturn itself, but also its moons. It wasn't particularly planned to study Enceladus until they actually saw images of these geysers coming up through cracks in what looked like ice. And so as far as we know, is mostly liquid H2O water ice. And so what we think is there's a warm enough ocean underneath that ice layer that could actually create geysers that push up into space. which you might think, well, that's a huge amount of energy. How do you create a geyser that's so strong it pushes into space? Well, remember, this is a pretty small moon, so the gravity is much weaker than it is on the Earth. So pushing into space isn't such a big deal. But regardless, we have an environment with energy, liquid water in this case, not methane or ethane, so less exotic. And maybe there's just a whole, cornucopia of life that's living down here in this ocean, has been living there ever since the moon was formed about 4 billion years ago. Who knows, right? We have to go there and see. Okay, so could there be life on? Could there have been life on Mars? Yes. Is there life there today? Probably not. But could there currently be life living in the subsurface oceans, or even in this strange environment of methane and ethane on Titan? Yeah, maybe right now today, right? It may not be complex life, but even if we find bacteria, I mean, just think about how that would change our perspective of evolution, of life, of just the biological sciences and how they combine with the physical sciences. It would be incredible, right? But who knows? Maybe we won't find anything, but that doesn't mean that it isn't possible elsewhere, because we can look further out. We can look for life around other stars. The emerging science of exoplanet discovery and exoplanet kind of, just criteria that we can look at exoplanets, and we can measure their masses and their densities with further and further accuracy. We can use methods like the transit method and the Doppler wobble method of stars, and just get these higher and higher resolution signals, all for the most part indirect signals of these exoplanets. We're not taking pictures of them, because they are, after all, incredibly weak light sources that are light years away. But we know they're out there, at the very least, based on the way they cause stars to wobble. We know that there's lots of interesting types of exoplanets that make our solar system look like it's fairly unusual. That our solar system, in terms of having Jupiter and stable circular orbits, is not the norm. It's not unheard of, but it's kind of one special case of solar systems. But we see that there's a whole variation of different types of solar systems, different types of exoplanets, and many of them certainly meet the criteria of being able to support life just on their distance from their star and their size. So we have straight up candidates for, not like, basically alternate Earths, other planets around other stars that are in the right conditions like ours. So we say, well, if things worked out like they did on Earth, maybe they worked out there, and so then we have many of them, right, that we know where they are. So we say that these are potential places of life, right? So that's a very interesting field of science. Now, there's no chance of ever sending space probes to any of these planets. So that's a big difference from what I was talking about in terms of, going to Enceladus or going to Titan, right? Because that we will do that, right? Those missions are just a few 100 million kilometers, still a great distance. And in some cases, maybe to get to Enceladus, almost 500 million kilometers. That's no joke, right? Many months or years long mission, but years, in fact. But we could never go to these other stars. Based on current technology, it would take hundreds or thousands of years, tens of thousands of years. And in fact, based on our current space probes, like the Voyager ones that are leaving the solar system, they won't reach another star for tens of thousands of years. So essentially never, right? So these stars and their exoplanets are, for all intents and purposes, unreachable based on any known science. An idea that we'll touch on very briefly at the end of this lecture. But regardless, we can still speculate, right? And we can think about, can we measure a signal of life? Could we measure free oxygen based on the actual emission, the emission spectra or absorption spectra from these planets, right? As we get better and better telescopes and better techniques, such as the recently launched James Webb Space Telescope, right? Which is in fact going to be wonderful for studying exoplanets. Are we going to be able to see some telltale signature of life, or are we going to find a planet that is just the right condition for life and send some colony ship there based on some future technology, send people off to essentially colonize it, hoping that we can live there? Or are we going to see a planet that looks like it can support life and then realize that they're sending us a radio message? So these are all interesting things to speculate about. So I mentioned this idea of requirements for habitability, and that's tied in very, very tightly to this idea of the habitable zone, which is a particular distance based on the size of the star and basically wavelength output, peak wavelength output of the star, and which would be its temperature, so size and temperature, that say what is the ideal distance, or in fact the distance and the range of distances that would support liquid water on the surface. Okay, and often it's liquid water on the surface with a certain amount of greenhouse effect, so it's assuming some atmosphere. Sometimes the habitable zone can in fact be expanded in terms of of certain types of planets. So we know when we look at exoplanets, there's such things as super Earths and water worlds, which are a type of kind of near Neptune-sized planet that is like a hot Jupiter, but it's like a hot Neptune. And these worlds, which in the case of super Earths and water worlds, sound like they could be definitely support life, they extend the habitable zone because they're both larger. They means that they can hold on to special types of atmospheres, like hydrogen-rich atmospheres, which could cause them to actually have more greenhouse effect, which wouldn't be great if you're comparing to Venus and a runaway greenhouse effect, but would be good if you want to have a planet that is either too far or too close to a star, but then able to actually create a habitable zone regardless. Okay? So a habitable world contains the basic necessities, as we talked about. That's going to be the energy, the nutrients, and some liquid. Okay? But it doesn't necessarily have life. Of course not, right? We have no idea. This is speculation. And that's why scientists think, is there some way we can look for a signal like free oxygen? Because we don't know of any way that free oxygen is created other than through, photosynthesizing life. So could we actually look at some of these worlds that we already know to be in habitable zones and actually see a free oxygen signal? Not based on current, telescope technology, but if we get better telescopes, like that would be amazing, right? So star system constraints, they need to be old enough. So very young star systems would never support life. We know that, at a basic level, evolution takes time, at least millions or hundreds of millions of years. A star system that's only a few 100,000 years would just simply be too young. It needs to have stable orbits, right? So very exotic orbits with complex binary systems aren't great for supporting life because there wouldn't be a reliable amount of sunlight. It would change dramatically. And that's about 50% of planets. So basically, or 50% of planetary systems. So right away, we can actually say a lot of planetary systems, about half, are probably not great candidates for life, at least not life as we know it, comparing to, kind of Earth being the optimal case, our sample size of 1, and that rate distance, the habitable zone. And that's relative to the heat, the temperature and size of the star. Okay. So within that constraint, there should still be billions of stars. So there's 100 billion stars in the Milky Way. Cut that number in half, you got 50 billion, and then say, okay, well then you got to how to have a planet in the right region. Well, it turns out that when we've been looking and cataloging, all these systems nearby within the first kind of 10, 30, 50, 100 light years away from Earth. That's where we're making all these exoplanet discoveries. We found thousands at this point, some 6,000 exoplanets. Well, of that incredible catalog of exoplanets, there's not so many that are Earth-like, but there's a bias not to find them. So we think that there's probably many that we're not detecting because they're a little too small to easily detect. It's much easier to detect a Jupiter because a Jupiter has a stronger pull on the star, and that's the best way to detect them. Well, regardless, there's going to be tons out there. There's going to be tons of planets that meet these criteria. Billions. That's remarkable, right? So we have billions of planets that meet the criteria for life. Well, does that mean that everyone has it? Or is life kind of rare? We don't know, right? So, the more massive the star, the larger its habitable zone, less massive, tighter in a habitable zone. Okay, so what are good things that scientists would consider kind of good for life? Well, definitely being in the habitable zone, some heat source, so volcanism, plate tectonics for cycling those nutrients, right? A magnetic field, right? Which we actually, because that's gonna lead to a better atmosphere. This idea that more complex life could form because it doesn't have to worry about so much mutation. That's actually a big argument for complex life forming on Earth. All right. So where are we going to find good habitable planets? Well, we just don't know, right? And we're not going to know for sure. It's just a lot of speculation, but it's still a wonderful field of science where you can just build all this information and speculate to our scientific heart's content. And as I said before, as we extend our possibilities, we have to consider obviously moons. I mentioned moons in our own solar system, but honestly, all these other solar systems, they probably have a bunch of other moons that could potentially harbor life, right? So if you think about just all the little opportunities for life, and again, the fact that we see life surviving in so many different harsh conditions here on Earth, it just seems like there's just a lot of opportunities, but maybe not for complex life. Right? Maybe what there is just lots and lots of basic life. Maybe we'll even find it within our own solar system. And maybe all these other solar systems, different or alike to our own, also have, planets that have for billions of years, kind of just kept along with some kind of bacterial level of life. Who knows? Okay. Now, could we detect it? Like I said, could we look for telltale signatures like free oxygen, right? Maybe, could we actually look for that oxygen and ozone layer? You just need the right telescopes, okay? We need specialized telescopes. So what have we learned in this section? We've learned requirements for surface habitability, being the right distance from a star, okay? But surface habitability isn't the end of the story. Subsurface habitability is a whole other field of research. Furthermore, extrasolar planets, so exoplanets, I call them exoplanets for short, but extrasolar planets is a more complete name. Well, there's going to be a huge variety of Earth-like, or as I said, super Earth or water worlds, right? These are all kind of, good candidates. I mean, even a Mars-sized planet, so a planet half the size of Earth, if it's the right distance from a star, would be a great candidate for life as well, right? It's a little on the small side, but if it's a little bit closer in, it could stay warm enough, right? It might not, it might need a very weak magnetic field to keep it going, but it still runs that risk of cooling off too fast. You need to be able to hold on to your heat. And actually, furthermore, young solar systems, right? Because think about how Mars was ideal with liquid water, as far as we know, for just a few 100 million years. Well, we could catch a solar system at the right time. That isn't ours, right? So there's actually that's a good point that scientists bring up, that if we really want to look for the best candidates of life, we actually probably should be looking for mostly young solar systems, not too young, but a sweet spot where a lot of their kind of mid-sized terrestrial planets haven't cooled off too much. Okay, because we've been able to hold on to their heat, and not go runaway greenhouse effect like Venus, but we're the only one of the three candidate planets that did that. Mercury was never a good candidate for the right conditions for life. And how could we detect it? Well, maybe looking for particular atmospheric gases like free oxygen, particularly O2 and O3. And O3 is called ozone. Right, that would be a clue. So how do we actually search for extraterrestrial life? Do we just look for the exoplanets and the candidates? Well, no, we actually look more directly. We actually look for those radio signals that I hinted at a minute ago. So ever since, I think, the 1960s, 1970s, there has been a branch of, at least, like official science within the United States called the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. Notice the word intelligence. That's because they're actually looking for a civilization that would be broadcasting. They look in the radio waves because they assume that's how at a long distance we would pick up a signal. And also, maybe if an alien was trying to send out a signal, they'd use radio waves because they'd be aware of their ability to travel long distances. I say that because if we were try to send a signal in a shorter wavelength, it would get scattered. It wouldn't make it to other stars. Radio waves, being meters or kilometers long, have long enough wavelengths to maintain a signal over many light years. And in that context, that means that we're looking literally for aliens, in the sense of, aliens out there that are, self-aware like we are. Well, that brings them to the question: if there are, again, billions of stars that have the right conditions for life, so maybe an Earth-like planet that, in terms of its atmosphere and an appropriate distance from the star and everything we talked about. Well, so let's say there's a billion of those. Well, then that's a huge number. A billion right condition Earth-like planets in just our galaxy. Remember, there's 100 billion galaxies or more, but we'll not worry about that for now because intergalactic distances are huge, right? But in terms of maybe ever being able to communicate, okay, it's 2 million light years to the nearest galaxy. That'd be a 2 million time delay if we were to send a signal back and forth between us and Andromeda. So that's what I mean. It's like it's like an insurmountable hurdle. But if we just think about stars that are a few light years away, well, then you send a signal, maybe it takes 20 years to get there. Then the alien civilization, you can send a signal back. That's another 20 years, total 40 years of communication time. That's slow, but realistic, right? You could actually communicate. So, okay, then where are the aliens? There's this thing called the Fermi paradox that says if there's all this probability of aliens, where are they? Why haven't they built an intergalactic civilization? If they, like we see humans building off our successes, becoming more and more complex. Well, what if a species has more time? Don't they become complex enough that they start traveling between the stars? Why haven't we been visited by such a complex alien species? Are they just avoiding us? Or are alien species very rare? What's going on? So we can actually kind of speculate about the probabilities, and that speculation, it falls in the context of what's called the Drake equation, which is this kind of estimate, which is the number of civilizations with whom we could potentially communicate right now. Okay? And it's based on just a simple multiplication of factors that can range between 0 and 1. So it's very much a probability, right? And, it's just everything ranges between 0 and 1. 1 is a sure chance, 0 is no chance. So the first of those probabilities that we're multiplying together is total number of habitable planets in the galaxy. Maybe that's, like I said, 5 billion, maybe it's 10 billion, maybe it's 50 billion, Then fraction of those that have life. Well, we don't know, right? Because again, we just know for sure that life is literally on one planet, right? But of all the opportunities that life seems to take, maybe, we can say 1% of those, right? And that, I don't know if that's conservative or not, because we literally don't know. It's kind of makes it interesting, but also frustrating. Then how many of those actually have a civilization? Because that's the thing, is there a bias for simplified life? Well, there almost certainly is, right? It seems like, if you look throughout our own planet, we're the only uh, animal that was ever to become complex enough to build a civilization, and so on, right? There's other intelligent animals, that seem to be, able to solve problems, right? From the dolphins to the crows to the other primates, but none of them got to the civilization level. So that seems like it doesn't happen that often, right? It happened once on Earth. Was that a fluke? Well, so we can speculate on a percentage there, right? So F civ will be some fraction of planets that have life that then have civilized life. And then how many of those civilizations are currently around, right? Because you think about civilization, like as humans, right? So we've been, smart enough to have languages and, gathering together for hundreds of thousands of years. We've had, written languages and cities for about 10,000 years. These are incredibly short periods of time, incredibly short in terms of, just geological time, let alone astronomical time. So does that mean that civilizations maybe don't live that long? We don't know, right? Because certainly we know that we're capable of wiping ourselves out. We discovered nuclear power. We could literally cause a complete extinction of the human species with our current contained nuclear power. So, right there, it's interesting that we could wipe ourselves out, let alone a comet collision could just wipe us out, because all humans are on one planet. And so perhaps civilizations are, by their very nature, kind of, not great at surviving, right? So maybe that's why we don't see that many of them. So it's just all these kind of this far out speculations are actually what are involved in the Drake equation. Because if we do give particular values between 0 and 1 to each of these numbers, then we can actually come up with a total number of how many intelligent species, civilized intelligent species, we could communicate with right now in our own galaxy. And maybe it's 1, maybe it's 10,000, literally, because that's how wide the values range. So humans have comparatively large brains, so that was a specialization. So that makes us think, so that seemed to be something that had to have happened to allow us to have enough, relative, brain matter to body mass to get to where we are. So, is that just like a random chance? It doesn't happen very often. Makes you think, right? So how does SETI actually work, right? So it looks for deliberate signals, so it scans the universe in honestly increasingly sophisticated ways. Early on it was hard to really, cover a significant amount of the sky, and they chose particular stars they thought were good candidates. Now we can choose stars that have, first of all, exoplanets that we know something about. So we sort of look in a concentrated way at those solar systems with those exoplanets that might have habitable Earth-like planets. So that's cool, right? A focus that we couldn't have done decades ago. And with, computerization and increased radio coverage of these dishes, and this is essentially a radio telescope that you're seeing in this image. I know they just look like, like what you call a radio dish, but that's what a radio telescope is, right? It's not looking at visible light. It's looking at a different part of the EM spectrum, radio waves. And that's because, again, that's what we'd expect, these deliberate signals to be sent as radio waves. Certainly not X-rays, right? Again, they get scattered, right? And not visible light either. Have we sent deliberate signals? Yeah, right. We sent these kind of rudimentary signals that we assume, that any alien could interpret based on like some shared understanding of mathematics. Certain things that are universal, like pi, because pi is just a ratio of the circumference of a circle to its diameter. So so that idea should be universal. Aliens should know what pi is, just like we do. So if we can leverage that shared language of math, we send out these signals that do so. And maybe aliens are doing the same thing, but we don't know. We've never detected any deliberate signals. So how many civilizations are out there? We don't know, but the Drake equation can give us an estimate that varies very widely, okay? But at least it gives us something. And then how does SETI work? We're looking for those deliberate signals using radio telescopes. All right, so very last topic here, interstellar travel. Because we've talked about this idea, okay, that there might be aliens. Then the Fermi paradox, which I mentioned briefly, there's no slide for it, is this is not really a paradox, but it says if there's so many opportunities for aliens, where are they and why haven't they built an intergalactic civilization? Well, perhaps the answer to that is or not even intergalactic, but intragalactic, in the sense that throughout the galaxy, connecting the whole galaxy, not necessarily between galaxies again, because the distances are so great, but could we hop between stars? But even hopping between stars are unbelievable distances, because a solar system, this like small little pocket of planets, maybe a few of which harbor life, maybe a few moons of which have rudimentary life in subsurface oceans, if that is the case in our own solar system. Well, that little pocket of life, our entire solar system, would be the size of a park, and then the next solar system, in our case, our nearest neighbor being the Andromeda solar system. Sorry, not Andromeda, the Alpha Centauri. I said the name of the galaxy, but the nearest solar system is Alpha Centauri. Well, that solar system, also the size of a small park, would be across the United States. So if our solar system is in California, then that other solar system is the size of a park, and it's in New York State. And in between is just vast emptiness of interstellar space, because solar systems are just tiny little leftover, pockets of matter that didn't fall into the star. Almost all the matter that was the nebula became the star, and that means that there's just vast emptiness between most stars. So we have this huge problem that to actually travel between stars and have some sort of alien contact between them is hard to even comprehend, because the physics just don't work. How would we actually do it? How would we have interstellar travel? And so we're going to talk here a little bit about kind of like the speculative physics in terms of what would that even look like, right? So current spacecraft travel at less than 1/10,000th the speed of light. That means that at that rate, it takes them about 100,000 years. Like I said, tens of thousands of years, right? But it's about 10 of them, so it's about 100,000 years to get to the nearest star. Okay, and the optimistic, you could say maybe 60,000, but that's way too slow, right? There's no way you could realistically travel between stars, and do anything with that travel if that travel took 60,000 years, Well, can we travel faster? We would need some energy source, whether that's fusion, which we haven't really successfully contained, or maybe some other energy source like matter, antimatter, that we just don't have today. We need some much more efficient energy source, right? We need some way of dealing with the cosmic ray problem, because even if we could accelerate a spacecraft up to an appreciable speed of the speed of light, when it's traveling through that interstellar space, it's actually not completely empty. It's full of about 1 atom per cubic centimeter or 1 atom per cubic millimeter. Well, every one of those atoms, even if it's just like a single ionized hydrogen or something, is going to, relative to a spacecraft that's actually accelerated to some reasonable speed where it can travel between stars and only take a few years, when it hits that particle will act like a cosmic ray, and it'd be difficult to shield for it. So some scientists think, well, maybe we could build spacecraft to take advantage of that, make it part of the system where they're actually pulling in those cosmic rays and using their energy to fuel their engine. But it's all very speculative, right? So this idea, then, we finally coming back to a slide on Fermi's paradox, is that maybe this issue, this fundamental physical issue, is that interstellar travel is nearly impossible. And yes, maybe there's some species that are specialized, putting themselves in stasis, or so that they can make it a journey that takes them a few hundred years, right? And they more efficient engines, but it still takes them a few hundred years to travel between stars. And maybe they're good, like I said, putting themselves in stasis. And that's great. Then they can travel between stars. But would we be aware of that, right? Because it would take many human generations for them to, say, get to us, So, that's the thing. So we may or may not be alone, but we could kind of be effectively alone, because it's just that it's so hard to travel or communicate, right? And perhaps it's just that our planet is, in this fact that life evolved to become humans, the self-reflected intelligent species, is just precious and rare, right? So, we just don't know. But we should certainly appreciate our own incredible nature in this universe, and that we don't know of it as being anything other than unique, right? Yeah. But maybe there is a galactic civilization, as science fiction loves to speculate, and someday they will contact us. So, right, are aliens, out there? We don't know. Are they plausible? Yes, they are plausible, absolutely. But there are some serious questions. It isn't just a matter of saying oh yeah, they're out there, people are lying about it as conspiracy, because, like I said, interstellar travel is a huge problem. These distances are incredibly difficult to think of any, even an advanced alien species, overcoming. So maybe there are aliens, but maybe we'll never contact them. Or maybe, like I said, kind of pessimistically, maybe we'll wipe ourselves out or be wiped out by a natural event before we have a chance to. And someone will later find, some alien exploration will find a record, some evidence that once there was a civilization here. Wouldn't that be interesting? So who knows? Well, I hope you found this discussion on life in the universe interesting and informative. Thank you so much for watching.